Welcome to the channel where history meets mind-blowing facts. Here your knowledge will get a powerful boost with every video. From hidden events to legendary figures, we cover it all. In the shadowy corridors of medieval England's history, one name echoes with reverence and fear: the Black Prince. But long before he earned that chilling title, before blood stained his sword and his enemies trembled at his banner, he was simply Edward of Woodstock, a boy born into power, war, and destiny. The year was 1330, and the English crown was firmly held by his father, King Edward III. From the moment Edward took his first breath in the royal palace at Woodstock, expectations wrapped around him like armor. He wasn't just born into nobility. He was born to lead, to conquer, and to defend the honor of a kingdom already locked in tension with its neighbors. As a child, Edward wasn't raised like ordinary boys. His toys were wooden swords, his lullabies the echoes of ancient victories, and his bedtime stories were tales of Arthurian legends, chivalry, and glory on the battlefield. Every lesson he learned, every mentor assigned to him, was designed with one purpose: to mold him into the ultimate warrior prince. Unlike many nobles of his time, he didn't grow up in isolation from the realities of war. He trained relentlessly in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and strategy, not in comfort, but under pressure. His tutors were not just scholars, but battle-hardened, knights who demanded discipline and ferocity in equal measure. At the age when most boys were still discovering the world, Edward was already preparing to command armies. His mind absorbed tactics like a sponge. He studied the weaknesses of former English kings and the brutal mistakes that had cost England dearly in past battles. He was fascinated by the Roman generals, inspired by Alexander the Great, and shaped by his father's own campaigns against the Scots. The looming shadow of the French crown cast a dark tension over England, and Edward knew he would one day be called upon to face it. His early exposure to the royal court taught him more than just etiquette. He saw treachery behind silk curtains, loyalty tested by gold, and diplomacy that could turn into war with a single misstep. He learned how to read a man's intentions from a glance, how to win respect without drawing a sword, and most importantly, how to control fear, his own and that of others. Yet behind the polished armor and royal prestige, there was something brewing inside the young prince, something darker, sharper, a hunger for more than just the crown. He didn't just want to be king one day. He wanted to be remembered. When the whispers of war with France turned into roars, Edward didn't flinch. In 1346, at only 16 years old, he accompanied his father on a campaign that would define the next stage of his life. But even before stepping onto the blood-soaked fields of France, the young prince had already begun to command attention, not just because of his lineage, but because of the fire in his eyes, the way he studied the battlefield like a seasoned general. His presence was magnetic, his confidence contagious. Veterans who had fought for decades found themselves placing faith in the boy with the lion heart. He wasn't just bold, he was brilliant. During marches, he would ride alongside his commanders, questioning decisions, suggesting alternatives. At first, some saw it as arrogance, a spoiled prince playing war. But that illusion shattered quickly. He anticipated enemy movements, understood terrain advantages, and could rally morale with a single speech. Every order he gave was decisive, not reckless. His instincts were razor-sharp, honed not by experience, but by an almost uncanny understanding of warfare. There was something almost unnatural about how easily he adapted to war, as if he'd been born for it. Back in England, stories of the prince's presence at the front lines began to spread. Minstrels sang of his courage, nobles praised his strategic mind, and even common soldiers spoke his name with a mixture of awe and loyalty. But Edward didn't bask in the glory. He sought something deeper. Battlefield dominance, the kind that could only be earned through blood, steel, and victory. His armor gleamed not just with polish but with purpose. His sword wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of his will. And as the drums of war beat louder, Edward was no longer just a prince of England. He was becoming something else entirely. Something that neither crown nor coin could define. Something forged not in gold but in fire and death. The world hadn't seen it yet, but it was coming. The Black Prince. The summer of 1346 was blistering, and the fields of northern France were heavy with the scent of fear, sweat, and looming death. A storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the hearts of two nations. France, proud and powerful, with an immense army that dwarfed its English enemy in size and strength, prepared to crush what they saw as an arrogant invasion. And at the heart of this daring English force was a teenage prince, Edward of Woodstock, barely 16, riding into history not as a boy seeking glory, but as a leader ready to etch his name into the bones of the earth. This was not just a war. This was a moment that would decide the future of kingdoms, and at the center of it all was a battlefield soon to be soaked in blood, Crécy. The English were outnumbered and they knew it. Estimates placed the French army at twice, perhaps 3 times the size of the English force, yet numbers meant nothing to Edward. While others saw hopeless odds, he saw opportunity. The French were confident, too confident. They charged forward with knights gleaming in polished armor, banners waving in arrogance, believing that sheer force would shatter the English line like glass. But the young prince had studied war like scripture. He didn't rely on brute strength. He relied on position, timing, and the most devastating weapon of the age, the English longbow. Edward's father, King Edward III, gave his son command of a crucial portion of the army. It was not a ceremonial title. The prince would lead men, give orders, and face death just like any other commander. There was no room for hesitation, and Edward didn't flinch. He took his position on a small rise in the land, a tactical advantage that would soon become a death trap for the enemy. His longbowmen were placed in calculated lines, stakes hammered into the ground to impale onrushing cavalry, and the fields in front of them were open and wide, perfect for a slaughter. The French forces, led by King Philip VI, began their assault, with full force. The renowned Genoese crossbowmen were ordered to weaken the English lines, but the skies had turned against them. A sudden rain had dampened their bowstrings, rendering their weapons useless. As they advanced, confused and exposed, the English longbowmen unleashed hell. Arrow after arrow rained down in a thunderous, merciless storm. The Genoese were cut down before they could even get close. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. And then came the French knights, charging forward with blind fury, their horses thundering across the field. But the terrain betrayed them. Mud slowed their advance, and the English stakes broke their momentum. Again the longbowmen fired. Thousands of arrows filled the sky, descending like a black swarm, piercing armor, flesh, and bone. Horses screamed, men fell, The chaos was unimaginable, and amidst the roar of death, the Black Prince stood firm. He was in the thick of it, not watching from behind, but fighting alongside his men. His black armor gleamed under the dim sky, and it was here that many believe he began to earn the name, the Black Prince. Not from his armor alone, but from the shadow of fear he cast over his enemies. Wave after wave of French knights charged, and wave after wave they were pushed back, broken, trampled by their own men, dying in heaps beneath the weight of pride and miscalculation. At one point, the French seemed close to breaking through. The fighting around Edward grew intense. Word reached King Edward III that his son might be overwhelmed. A commander asked if reinforcements should be sent. The king asked if his son was dead. "No, my liege," the man replied. "He fights on." The king then responded with words that would become legend. "Let the boy win his spurs." It was more than a test, it was a defining moment. And Edward did not just survive, he dominated. By the end of the day, the field was littered with the dead. French nobility lay scattered, their golden crests stained red, their banners crumpled in the mud. Among the dead was the blind King John of Bohemia, who had charged into battle tied to his knights so he could fight with honor, only to meet a noble but brutal end. The Black Prince, moved by the king's courage, took his emblem, the 3 white feathers, and made them his own. That same emblem is still used today by the Prince of Wales, a lasting echo of that violent, glorious day. Crécy wasn't just a victory. It was a message. It was the birth of a legend. A teenage prince facing impossible odds had broken the back of the French elite with strategy, skill, and sheer will. He had earned the respect of kings, the fear of nations, and the undying loyalty of his men. No longer was he simply Edward of Woodstock. From the ashes of Crécy, the world began to speak a new name, one whispered in reverence, one feared on the battlefield. The Black Prince. War builds legends, but it also reveals shadows. And for Edward, the Black Prince, that shadow began to grow long and dark as his fame soared. After the glory of Crécy and later, the stunning capture of the French king at the Battle of Poitiers, Edward became a hero across England. Songs were sung about his victories. Poets compared him to ancient gods of war. But beneath the polished armor and the cheers of the people, something darker began to take root. Because behind every shining legacy lies a truth that history tries to bury. And for the Black Prince, that truth was forged in fire, cruelty, and a hunger for domination that would cost countless lives. In the years following his victories, Edward wasn't content with resting on past glory. He was made Prince of Aquitaine, a vast and unstable region in southwestern France. It was there that the nature of the prince began to shift. Once seen as the golden boy of England's future, Edward became something else. A ruler hardened by conflict, cornered by rebellion, and driven to extremes. As the local nobles resisted English rule, the Black Prince didn't respond with diplomacy or negotiation. He answered with fire and steel. What began as tactical pressure quickly escalated into brutal retaliation. He ordered scorched earth campaigns through the French countryside. Farms burned, villages razed, and civilians left homeless. These were not simply acts of war. These were messages. Defiance would not be tolerated. But it was one event, above all, that cast the darkest stain on his legacy. The sack of Limoges in 1370. Limoges was a wealthy city, technically under Edward's rule, but it had switched allegiance back to the French. To Edward, this was more than betrayal. It was personal. He had once considered the bishop of the city, Jean de Croce, a friend. That friendship shattered when the gates of Limoges were opened to the enemy. Enraged, Edward launched an assault, with an army hungry for vengeance. What followed was one of the bloodiest episodes of the 100 Years' War. When the city fell, Edward ordered his troops to show no mercy, and they obeyed. For 3 days, Limoges was turned into a charnel house. Men, women, and children, thousands, were slaughtered in the streets. Homes were set ablaze with people still inside. The wails of the dying echoed through the city as the Black Prince rode through the carnage, cold and unmoved. Reports from the time speak of at least 3,000 civilians killed, though some claim the number was far higher. It wasn't just vengeance. It was a warning, and it worked. The region fell back into line, but at what cost? Some chroniclers defended the massacre, calling it necessary. Others condemned it as a monstrous act of cruelty. But Edward himself never apologized, never showed regret. To him, it was a calculated decision. In his mind, it was justice. But for many, it was the day the shining knight of England became something else entirely. A symbol not of hope, but of terror. And then, as if the heavens themselves were judging him, the invincible prince began to crumble. Not in battle, but in body. Disease took hold. Most believe it was dysentery, a slow, agonizing illness that robbed him of his strength, his stamina, his fire. The once proud warrior who had ridden at the head of armies could barely rise from his bed. He grew pale, skeletal, and hollow-eyed, and with each passing year, his fury grew. By the time the year 1376 arrived, the Black Prince, once the pride of England, the terror of France, the living embodiment of chivalric power, was no longer the fierce warrior who had crushed armies at Crécy and Poitiers. The brilliant commander, who had ridden into battle clad in black armor, fearless and unbreakable, was now a shadow confined to his chambers, ravaged by illness. His body, once strong enough to lift swords and inspire nations, had withered. The disease that had gnawed, at him for years had finally claimed all but his will. Still, within the fragile frame of the dying prince, the fire of his purpose flickered on. He had no intention of slipping quietly into death. There was one final war to fight, not against men or kings, but against time, and the fear that everything he had built could crumble the moment he closed his eyes for the last time. Edward of Woodstock had fought for the English crown his entire life, not for himself alone, but for a kingdom he believed could dominate the world. He had bled for it, commanded for it, killed for it, but now, bedridden and slipping away, he knew with brutal clarity that he would never sit upon the throne. The dream of becoming King Edward IV was over. He had led armies and ruled territories, but fate had other plans. His disease, believed to be dysentery or possibly a degenerative illness, had robbed him of his strength long before he could claim the title that had always seemed his destiny. And now, the future of England and his bloodline rested in hands far smaller and more uncertain, those of his young son, Richard. Richard was only 9 years old, a boy born into greatness but untested by war or politics. Edward had seen what power did to weak men, how quickly vultures circled when the throne looked vulnerable. He feared what would happen to his son in a court full of ambitious lords, jealous nobles, and dangerous advisors. So, with the last of his strength, he summoned his father, King Edward III, and the royal council. Lying in the silence of his chamber, surrounded by candlelight and the smell of herbs meant to ease his pain, the Black Prince did not ask for riches or monuments. He made only one request, that his son be protected, and that his right to the ideal crown be honored when the time came. It was a moment that stripped away all legend, all armor, all fury. Edward was no longer the warrior prince, he was a father, desperate to shield his child from the storm he would leave behind. And those who witnessed it knew they were in the presence of something powerful, not the roar of battle, but the silent courage of a man facing death with clarity and purpose. On June 8, 1376, Edward of Woodstock took his final breath. He was just 45 years old. England lost not only a prince, but one of its greatest military minds. The people mourned. The soldiers wept. The court fell into solemn silence. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, his tomb a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship. But it wasn't the beauty of the stonework that left a mark. It was the words engraved upon it, words he had written himself, a chilling poetic reflection on the fleeting nature of life, youth, and power. It spoke of how once he had held the world in his hands, but now he was dust, as all men must become. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy of what comes for all who rise, conquer, and eventually fall. His son would become Richard II, but without his father's strength and leadership, the kingdom soon faltered. The nobility fractured. Trust eroded. The power Edward had held through fear and awe could not be passed down with a crown. It had been his alone. But while the politics of England shifted and power changed hands, the legend of the Black Prince endured. He remained a symbol of strength, strategy, and uncompromising will. A man who had been born into glory, but whose legacy was forged through hardship, brilliance, and yes, blood. His life is a reminder that true power is never given. It's taken, often at a great cost. And though the Black Prince never became king, he became something rarer, a myth in his own time, a legend that would echo through the centuries. His name still rings out in the annals of history, not as a monarch, but as something greater. England's deadliest medieval warrior. If this story captivated you, and you want to hear more forgotten tales from history that are just as intense and powerful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless, untold legends waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.